My mother didn't leave in the middle of the night. She left on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder of my school records, a check made out to my aunt, and the specific efficiency of someone who had already made peace with a decision they knew was wrong. I was 11 years old. I was standing at the top of the stairs holding my sketchbook against my chest like it could protect me from something. And my mother looked up at me from the hallway below, adjusted her coat, and said the sentence that I would spend the next 13 years learning to survive. "Evie, you'll be better off somewhere quieter." That was it. Not "I love you but this is hard." Not "I'm doing the best I can." Just "you'll be better off somewhere quieter," delivered in the same tone she used to tell me to clear my plate or close the back door. Matter of fact. Already moved on. My twin sister, Jade, stood behind her without meeting my eyes. Jade, who had a 94 average and a spot on the regional math competition team. Jade, whose report cards my mother laminated and put in a binder. Jade, who was not being sent anywhere because Jade was the kind of daughter my mother understood how to love. I was the other kind. And on that Tuesday afternoon, my mother drove me 4 hours north to my Aunt Rosie's house, handed over the folder, said something about structure and environment, kissed my forehead with the warmth of someone completing a task, and drove back home to the daughter who made sense to her. Then I sat down on Aunt Rosie's porch steps and didn't move for a very long time. I need to tell you who I am now so you understand what my mother walked back into when she finally decided it was time to reconnect. My name is Evie Callahan. I'm 24 years old. I'm a visual artist and illustrator based in Portland, Oregon, and 18 months ago I co-founded a small creative studio called Ground Floor with my partner Marcus and our friend Danny. We do illustration work for children's publishers, brand identity for small businesses, and educational design for nonprofits that work with kids who learn differently. The studio was built from the ground up. No investors. No family money. No safety net beyond the freelance income we had each scraped together for 2 years before we felt stable enough to sign a lease on a space. It is mine. Every piece of it. My mother had nothing to do with any of it. Which is why what she tried to do 18 months after we opened, the thing that made me understand I was still fighting a war she had never admitted she started, broke something open in me that I did not know was still closed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the girl who got sent away. Aunt Rosie's house was small and slightly chaotic in the best way. She taught elementary school art and had opinions about color theory that she would share at length whether or not you had asked. She had 3 cats, a garden that had gotten out of control in a way she found delightful, and a kitchen that always smelled like something was either baking or burning. She was also, in every way that mattered, the first adult who had ever looked at me and asked what I was good at before deciding what was wrong with me. The first week, I barely spoke. I sat in the spare room surrounded by boxes she hadn't gotten around to unpacking and tried to understand how I had become a problem so large that the solution was removing me entirely. My mother's logic, as she had explained it to my father and various relatives, was that I was struggling academically, that I needed a different environment, that being constantly compared to Jade was harmful for both of us. These things contained enough truth to sound reasonable from the outside. From the inside, they translated differently. I was struggling. That part was accurate. But I wasn't struggling because I wasn't trying. I was struggling because every single measure of my worth in that house was academic, and I was a person made of other things. I was made of images. Of color and texture and the specific quiet joy of watching a blank page become something. I had been drawing since I could hold a pencil, filling sketchbooks with animals and buildings and faces that my mother glanced at briefly before asking if I had finished my math homework. In that house, what I could draw was invisible. What I could not do on a standardized test was permanent. So when I arrived at Aunt Rosie's and she set a fresh sketchbook on the kitchen table without saying a word about my grades, it took me 3 days to touch it. When I finally did, I sat down and drew for 4 hours straight without looking up. Aunt Rosie found me there at midnight. She looked at the pages, then at me. She said, "You needed somewhere to put all of that." I said I was sorry for being up so late. She said, "Don't apologize for the work. Just sleep when you're done." That was the beginning of everything. Middle school turned into high school at Aunt Rosie's kitchen table and in the art room of a small regional school where the teachers knew my name within the first month and meant it warmly. I still struggled with tests. That didn't change. Some things in your brain are wired the way they're wired and no amount of harder trying reconfigures them. But Aunt Rosie found a learning specialist who figured out I was dyslexic in a way that had never been identified because no one had thought to look, and once we had the right tools, things that had been walls became doors. I was never going to be Jade. I accepted that at 13 in the particular way you accept things when you're 13, not gracefully, not without pain, but permanently. What I discovered instead was that I was going to be me. And me, it turned out, was capable of things that didn't appear on any rubric. My senior year, I was commissioned by the town library to paint a mural. I want you to understand the scale of this. A 17-year-old with a local reputation for strange and detailed drawings was handed a wall inside a public building and told to make something that the community would look at for years. I spent 3 months on it. Mornings before school, weekends, every evening I could steal from homework. Aunt Rosie brought me sandwiches and sat nearby reading while I worked. She never told me to hurry. She never told me what to paint. The mural was of a forest at the edge of a town, and in the trees were dozens of small figures, some reading, some building things, some just sitting with their eyes closed in the particular silence of people who have finally found a place they're allowed to exist. The library director cried at the unveiling. An older man told me his late wife would have loved it. A woman from the local paper took photographs and wrote a short piece about a high school senior who had painted something that looked, she said, like a place everyone had been looking for without knowing the name of it. My mother called the weekend the article came out. She said she had seen the picture online and it was very sweet. Sweet. I thanked her. I hung up. I went back to my sketchbook and did not think about it for a long time, because thinking about it led somewhere I wasn't ready to go. College happened at an art and design program 2 states away, which I attended on a partial scholarship and supplemented with every freelance job I could find. I designed menus, logos, event posters, social media graphics, birthday invitations, band merchandise, and a set of illustrated flashcards for a kindergarten teacher who paid me in homemade jam and $50. I learned everything I could. I worked constantly. I had very little money and a very clear sense of what I was building toward. In my second year, I met Marcus. He was in the graphic design program and had the specific quality of quiet confidence that comes from people who have known who they were for a long time. He looked at my portfolio on our first conversation and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, and then said, "You see things in a really specific way. I want to know how that works." That was it. That was the sentence. We were friends for a year before anything else, which is, he was from a large extended family in New Mexico that operated the way families should, loud, warm, occasionally chaotic, fiercely present. His parents called to check in. His siblings sent memes and demanded he visit. His grandmother learned my name within 2 weeks of Marcus mentioning me and has called me Meej. I had never experienced that from my own blood, and it reset something fundamental about what I believed I was allowed to expect. My mother called on birthdays. My father sent cards with checked boxes for amounts. Jade and I texted occasionally, careful, surface-level exchanges that skimmed above the deep water we had never agreed to swim in. I graduated. Marcus and I moved to Portland. We found Danny through a mutual contact, discovered we had a shared vision for what ground floor could be, and spent 18 months building it into something real. The day we put our studio sign up was the happiest day of my professional life. Aunt Rosie drove 6 hours to be there. My mother sent a text that said, "Congratulations. Hope it goes well." The first sign that something was coming arrived in the form of a phone call from Jade. She never called without texting first. She had texted first since we were 12 and the calling had fallen away, so when her name appeared on my screen at 9 on a Thursday night without warning, I answered with my heart already running slightly ahead of me. She said, "Mom wants to visit Portland." I waited. She says she wants to see your studio. She says she wants to reconnect properly. I looked at Marcus across the kitchen. He raised his eyebrows in a question I didn't have words for yet. I said, "When did this become something she wanted?" Jade was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's been talking about it for a while. She saw the piece about ground floor in that design blog." The design blog. A small industry publication had run a feature on emerging creative studios in the Pacific Northwest 2 months earlier. They had included ground floor, published photographs of our space, quoted me at length about the mission of the studio and our work with children's literacy campaigns. My mother had found it. And now she wanted to visit. I said, "I'll think about it." Jade said, "She's not going to apologize first, Evie. You know how she is." I said, "I know exactly how she is." I sat with the phone for a long time after we hung up. Marcus made tea and sat beside me and waited. He was very good at waiting. He had learned early in our relationship that I needed time to find the words before I could speak them, and he gave me that time every single time without making it a sacrifice. I finally said, "She doesn't want to reconnect. She wants to see what I built." He nodded slowly. I said, "There's a difference." He said, "There is." I said, "I want her to see it. I want to see her face when she understands what I made without her. But I need it to be on my..." He looked at me steadily. He said, "Then set the terms." I called my mother back 2 days later. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, controlled, bright on the surface, with a very specific undertone of someone who believes every conversation is actually a negotiation. She said she was so glad I had called. She said she had been hoping we could close the distance. She said she was proud of what I had built and wanted to see it in person. Proud. That word from her mouth was a new thing. I rolled it around in my head like a stone I was trying to identify. I told her she and Jade could come for a long weekend in the fall. I told her I would set aside time to show them the studio. I told her I looked forward to it. I said nothing about the 13 years between that Tuesday afternoon on the stairs and this phone call. I said nothing about the library mural she had called sweet. I said nothing about the birthdays she had covered with checks and the graduation she had not attended and the studio opening where Aunt Rosie had cried and she had sent a text message. I just said, "I'll be in touch with the details." And then I called Aunt Rosie. Aunt Rosie drove to Portland 3 weeks before my mother was scheduled to visit. We sat in the studio after hours with takeout containers on the table and I told her everything. The call. The pride my mother had suddenly discovered. The specific quality of her voice that told me she had read the design blog article more than once and was reconsidering her math. Aunt Rosie listened the way she always had, completely, without rushing toward a response. When I finished, she asked, "What do you want to happen?" I said, "I want her to understand what she sent away." Aunt Rosie looked at me carefully. She said, "That's fair. But understanding is not the same as being sorry." I said, "I know." She said, "And you might not get the sorry." I said, "I know that too." She looked around at the studio. At the illustration work pinned to the display walls. At the children's book pages I had spent the past month finishing. At the poster series for the literacy nonprofit that was going up in schools across 3 counties. At the photographs above my desk, the library mural, our studio opening, a picture of Marcus and me at his parents' house in New Mexico where his grandmother was holding my hands in both of hers and laughing at something I had said. Aunt Rosie said, "Whatever happens, she is going to walk in here and see proof. Every day of work you put into this place is proof. You don't have to say a word." I looked at my studio. I thought about an 11-year-old girl at the top of the stairs holding a sketchbook. I thought about what that girl had needed someone to say and what she had needed someone to do. And then I decided what kind of weekend this was going to be. They arrived on a Friday afternoon. My mother was exactly as I remembered her, put together in the way of someone for whom appearance was a form of control, carrying herself with the specific straightness of a person who did not often find themselves in unfamiliar situations. She looked around the neighborhood when she got out of the car with the careful expression of someone forming a judgment they had not yet decided to share. Jade was beside her, slightly behind, watching my face the way she had always watched my face, looking for the emotional temperature of a room before deciding how to behave in it. I stood at the door. My mother smiled and opened her arms and I let her hug me the way you let an unfamiliar thing happen without either welcoming it or refusing it. It lasted about 3 seconds. She stepped back and looked at me. She said, "You look so well, Evie." I said, "Come inside." Marcus had made dinner. He was warm and easy with people he trusted, and he had met my mother twice before, both times briefly, in neutral territory, and he extended the same warmth now that he extended to everyone while keeping his eyes moving in the specific way that meant he was paying attention to more than the surface. Danny came by for dinner because I had asked her to, and because Danny was the kind of person who could hold a room steady without making it obvious she was doing it. We ate. We talked. My mother asked about the studio with the quality of genuine curiosity layered over the thing underneath it, which was assessment. She was looking at what I had built the way she used to look at my report cards, trying to assign it a value she understood. After dinner, I showed them the studio. "This is the part one want you to picture carefully." My mother walking through a space I had built. Stopping in front of a wall of children's book illustrations I had spent the past year developing. Reading the description of the literacy campaign that was going into schools. Looking at the framed print of the mural I had painted at 17, a high-quality photograph that the library had commissioned for us because they wanted to document it. She stopped at that print for a long time. I stood behind her and waited. She said, "Is this the one that was in the paper? When you were in high school?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't realize it was so large." Jade said quietly, "She spent 3 months on it, Mom." My mother turned around. Her face had something moving across it that I couldn't fully name. Not quite guilt. Not quite pride. Something in between that didn't have a clean word. She said, "You were always drawing." I didn't understand then what that meant. I looked at her. She said, "I think I made some mistakes." I held very still, because this was the moment, the exact moment, that could go either direction. Either she would go further and say the real thing, or she would stop there and let mistakes stand in for everything it was supposed to cover. She stopped there. Some mistakes. Not, I sent you away. Not, I chose your sister's future over your presence in our home. Not, I drove away from a girl holding a sketchbook and told myself it was for your benefit when it was for mine. Just, some mistakes. I said, yes. You did. She blinked. She had not expected me to agree that plainly. I said, I'd like to talk about that properly before the weekend is over. Her mouth tightened slightly. She said, of course. We went back to the apartment. Marcus put music on at a volume that meant no one had to fill every silence. Danny said her goodbyes. Jade and I sat on the balcony for a while after my mother went to the guest room. Jade said, she's trying. She said, she's not going to say everything you need to hear. I said, I know that too. Jade looked at her hands. She said, I should have been braver when we were kids. I should have said something. I looked at my sister. At the face that matched mine in structure but had been given a completely different set of circumstances to grow in. At the girl who had stayed home while I was driven away and had spent 13 years carrying the weight of that in a way I hadn't fully considered. I said, I know. She looked up. I said, it wasn't your job to fix it. You were a kid too. She started crying then. Quietly. The kind of crying that has been stored somewhere for a long time. I reached over and put my hand on her arm. That was not something we had done in years. Maybe ever, not since we were very young. We sat there on the balcony until it got cold. And the thing I felt was not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. A door that had been stuck for a long time finding just enough give to move. Saturday was the day everything shifted. My mother and I sat at the kitchen table after Marcus took Jade to see a local bookstore she had been talking about. He had suggested it with the specific casual ease of someone who has quietly engineered a situation to create the space someone else needs. Just my mother and me. Coffee going cold. Morning light through the window. The studio 2 blocks away holding its ground. She started by telling me about her work. About a project she was consulting on. About Jade's promotion. About a kitchen renovation they had started and not finished. All of it surface. All of it the conversation she knew how to have. I let her finish. Then I said, Mom. I need to ask you something directly. She went still. I said, do you understand why you sent me away? She said, you were struggling, Evie. You needed a different. That's the version you told everyone else, I said. I'm asking what the real reason was. She was quiet for a long time. I waited. She set her coffee mug down carefully. She looked at the table. Then she said something I had not expected, because it was the first honest sentence she had said to me in 24 years. She said, I didn't know how to help you. And I didn't want to admit that. I sat very still. She said, she fit the plan I had. The plan I understood. And you were something I couldn't measure, and I kept failing at it, she stopped. I told myself you'd be better with June because June understood what I didn't. But really I was removing the proof that I had failed at something. The room was very quiet. I said, you sent me away because I made you feel like a bad mother. She winced. But she didn't deny it. I said, and then Aunt Rosie took me in and taught me what I needed to know, and I built this, I gestured, meaning the studio, meaning Portland, meaning Marcus, meaning the whole shape of my life. And you found the article and decided it was time to reconnect. She said, Evie. I said, I'm not angry right now. I want you to understand that. I've spent a lot of years being angry and I've mostly moved through it. But I need you to understand what happened, not the version where you made a difficult but reasonable decision. The real version. She said, the real version makes me someone I don't like. I said, yes. It does. She was quiet. I said, and I need to know if you're here because you actually want to know me. Or if you're here because what I built looked impressive enough to want to claim. She flinched. I said, that's not an accusation. It's a question. And you don't have to answer it right now. But before this weekend is over, I need an honest answer. I picked up my mug and went to get more coffee. And I left her sitting with it. The answer came Saturday evening. Marcus and Jade had made dinner together, and the kind of easy collaboration that happens when two people are each operating slightly outside their usual dynamic and find it unexpectedly comfortable. Jade, it turned out, was someone who became significantly more herself when my mother was not in the room. I filed that away. After dinner, my mother asked if she could see the studio one more time. We walked over in the evening light, just the two of us. She moved through the space more slowly this time. She stopped at the children's book pages longer. She read the description of the literacy campaign all the way through. She stood in front of the mural photograph for even longer than she had the night before. Then she turned around and said, I came because of the article. You're right. I nodded. She said, I read it and I felt, she paused. I felt proud. And then I felt ashamed of feeling proud, because I hadn't done anything to make this possible. I said, Aunt Rosie did. And Marcus. And Danny. And a learning specialist named Carol who figured out I was dyslexic in 7th grade when you thought I just wasn't trying. She closed her eyes briefly. I said, she cost $40 an hour and Aunt Rosie paid for a year's worth of sessions out of her teacher's salary. She said, I didn't know. I said, you didn't ask. A very long silence. Then my mother said, I'm sorry, Evie. I waited. She said, not for sending you to June, because I think you needed her and I couldn't give you what she gave you. But I'm sorry for not asking. For not learning who you were before deciding I knew. For making you feel like you were a problem I was solving instead of a person I was supposed to love. I looked at her. In my whole life I had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. In the version in my head, there was always a bigger feeling attached to it. Relief or collapse or the specific dramatic unlocking of something. But standing in my studio in the evening light, it felt like putting something down. Not forgiveness. Not repaired. Not fine. Just, put down. I said, thank you for saying that. She said, does it help? I said, it's a start. She looked around the studio one last time. At the work. At the evidence. At 13 years of becoming someone without her. She said, she would have loved this. June. I said, she did love it. She drove 6 hours to be here when we opened. My mother nodded slowly. She said, I should have come. I said, yes. We walked back in the dark. Sunday, they left. Jade hugged me for longer than she usually did, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. She said, I want to do this better. With you. Going forward. I said, I want that too. She said, can we start from here? I said, that's the only place we can start from. She smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen from her in years, not the careful smile she wore when our mother was watching, but the one underneath it. The one I remembered from when we were 8 and 9 and sharing a room and the world hadn't sorted us into winners and losers yet. My mother hugged me at the door. She said, "I'll call. If that's all right." I said, "You can call." She nodded. She said, "I'm going to try to be better." I said, "I'll notice if you are." She looked surprised. Then she almost smiled. I watched their car until it turned the corner. Then Marcus appeared behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. I leaned back against him. He said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Like I won something. But not the thing I thought I was fighting for." He said, "What were you fighting for?" I said, "I thought I wanted her to see that I was right. That I had been worth keeping. But that's not," I stopped. "I already knew that. I've known that for years." I didn't need her to confirm it. He said, "Then what did you need?" I looked down the empty street. I said, "I think I needed her to finally stop pretending she didn't know what she did." He was quiet. I said, "And she did. That's more than I expected." We went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my sketchbook, the current one, the one I was using for the new book project, and I drew for 2 hours in the quiet of a Sunday morning while the city woke up around me. I drew a girl at the top of a staircase, holding a sketchbook. And then I drew where she ended up. My mother called the following Tuesday. She asked about a project I had mentioned. She asked whether the literacy campaign posters were up yet. She asked whether Marcus had family coming for the holidays. It was not a perfect call. She still had the quality of someone learning a language she had not grown up speaking. There were moments of awkward translation. But she called. And she asked. And she stayed on the line. Jade called the Thursday after that. We talked for an hour about things I didn't remember ever discussing with her before, what she was actually passionate about in her work, what exhausted her about it, what she thought she wanted her life to look like in 5 years. We talked about being twins and how strange it was to have the same face and such different histories. At the end, she said, "I'd been thinking about what you said. That it wasn't my job to fix it when we were kids." I said, "It wasn't." She said, "I'm making it my job now." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that allowed?" I said, "It's allowed." Aunt Rosie called on Friday evening the way she called every Friday, to talk about nothing and everything, about the mural she was planning with a new class of 4th graders, about a cat that had appeared in her garden and was refusing to leave, about whether the town library wanted to commission a new piece for their expanded wing. I told her everything about the weekend. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm proud of you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For not needing her to be something she isn't in order to be okay." I said, "I'm still working on it." She said, "That's what proud means." Here's what I know now that I didn't know when I was 11 years old at the top of those stairs. Being sent away felt like proof that I was wrong. That the thing I was, the way my brain worked, the things I cared about, the kind of intelligence I had that didn't appear on tests, was a defect. Something to be managed and minimized and eventually removed from the equation. It took years to understand that my mother had not sent me away because I was too little. She had sent me away because she was. She was too small for the version of motherhood that required learning who her child actually was. She was too comfortable with the plan she had made before I arrived to adjust it when I turned out differently. She was too afraid of admitting failure to sit with the discomfort of working through it. And Aunt Rosie was big enough for all of it. Which meant that the worst thing that ever happened to me was also, eventually, the thing that saved me. Not because suffering is noble or because pain has inherent meaning, but because the person I needed to become required being somewhere that had room for me. My mother's house did not have room for me. Aunt Rosie's kitchen, with its art supplies on the table and its cats and its pancakes for dinner when breakfast wasn't happening, that house had room. Marcus's family, with their grandmother who learned my name in 2 weeks and called me Mija, and his brothers who showed up with tools before anyone asked, that family had room. Ground floor studio, with its walls of illustrated work and its children's book pages and its posters going up in schools for kids who learn differently, that place has room. I built it to have room. Because I know what it costs when you don't have any. The children's book I was working on when my mother visited came out 6 months later. It was about a girl who could see colors that other people couldn't quite see, who described the world in a way that confused the people around her until she found a place where the way she saw things was considered a gift instead of a complication. The literacy nonprofit distributed it to 400 classrooms across 3 states. Aunt Rosie sent me a photo of her class reading it. 23 8-year-olds, seated in a circle, listening. My mother bought a copy and mailed it to me with a note that said, "I see you in every page." I sat with that note for a long time. Then I put it on my desk, next to the photograph of Aunt Rosie at the studio opening and the picture of Marcus's grandmother holding my hands. Next to the evidence of every person who had known how to make room. I used to think the story of being sent away was a story about a girl who wasn't smart enough, impressive enough, easy enough to love. I know now it was never that story. It was a story about what she lacked. About a woman who could not expand her definition of worth to include a child who learned differently, created beautifully, and needed something she didn't know how to give. And it was a story about what I found instead. A studio full of work that matters. A partner who asks how things work. A family by choice that teaches you what chosen means. An aunt who frames a $20 bill like a national award. And a sketchbook. Always a sketchbook. Proof that talent counts. Proof that worth doesn't require a rubric. Proof that the thing you were told was the wrong shape can turn out to be exactly the shape the world needed. My mother sent me away because she didn't understand what I was. I spent 13 years becoming it anyway. If someone told you growing up that the way you were built was a problem, if you've ever been the child who was too much or too little or just too different for someone who should have known better, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Because what my mother sent away in a car on a Tuesday afternoon came back with a studio, a sketchbook, a family that chose her, and a story worth telling. And the girl holding that sketchbook at the top of the stairs? She's the best thing my mother almost missed.